The sun beat down on the small town of Riverdale as Officer James Wilson pulled his patrol car into the parking lot of the local community center. He adjusted his uniform and glanced at himself in the rearview mirror, making sure his badge gleamed in the afternoon light. It was an important day in Riverdale, the annual community fair that brought together people from all walks of life to celebrate their diversity. Officer Wilson had been with the Riverdale Police Department for 15 years. To the outside world, he presented himself as a dedicated public servant, but those who worked closely with him knew a different side. His colleagues had noticed his tendency to treat people differently based on their skin color, harsher treatment for some, leniency for others. These weren't just coincidences, they were patterns that had been developing throughout his career. The community center buzzed with activity as people set up colorful booths displaying food, crafts, and information about local businesses and organizations. Children ran around with painted faces while volunteers hung banners and arranged chairs for the upcoming presentations. Among the volunteers was Raj Patel, a respected doctor who had moved to Riverdale 5 years ago. Despite his contributions to the community, including free health camps and fundraisers for the local school, he had experienced his fair share of prejudice. On more than one occasion, he had been pulled over by Officer Wilson for routine checks that somehow only seemed to happen to people who looked like him. "Dr. Patel, where would you like these pamphlets?" asked a young volunteer, holding a stack of health information brochures. "Just place them on the table by the entrance," Raj replied with a warm smile. "We want everyone to have access to this information as they come in." As Raj continued organizing his health awareness booth, he noticed Officer Wilson walking through the entrance, clipboard in hand. As the head of security for the event, Wilson was responsible for ensuring everything ran smoothly. Their eyes met briefly, and Raj nodded politely. Wilson merely looked away, focusing on his clipboard. On the other side of the room, Police Chief Thomas Roberts was helping set up the stage for the upcoming speeches. Unlike Wilson, Chief Roberts had been working hard to build bridges within the community. After several incidents in neighboring towns had made national headlines, Roberts had implemented new training programs and community outreach initiatives to ensure his department served everyone equally. "Wilson," Chief Roberts called out, "come help me with this banner." Officer Wilson reluctantly made his way to the stage, where the chief was struggling with a large, Community Unity banner. "Big turnout this year," Roberts commented as they worked. "I want our officers mingling, getting to know people. Community policing at its finest." Wilson nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." "I mean it, James," the chief continued, his voice dropping slightly. "There have been some complaints about your approach to certain members of our community. This is your chance to show everyone you're here to protect and serve, all of them." Wilson's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He'd heard these lectures before and considered them unnecessary political correctness. In his mind, he was just doing his job the way he'd always done it. As the fair officially opened, people from all parts of town streamed in. The atmosphere was festive, with music playing and the smell of various foods filling the air. Officer Wilson stood near the entrance, observing everyone who entered with a critical eye. A young high school teacher named David Chen approached Wilson with a friendly smile. "Officer, do you know where the schedule of events is posted? I have students performing later and want to make sure we don't miss our slot." Wilson barely glanced at Chen. "Check the information desk," he replied curtly before turning his attention elsewhere, despite the information desk being clearly visible from where they stood. Chen's smile faltered, but he nodded and walked away, used to such treatment. Throughout the afternoon, Wilson's behavior followed a clear pattern, warm and helpful to some attendees, cold and dismissive to others. People noticed, exchanging glances and whispers, but most chose to enjoy the fair rather than confront him. As the event progressed, Raja's health booth became one of the most popular spots. He offered free blood pressure checks and advice about healthy living, drawing a continuous stream of grateful residents. "You know, that Officer Wilson was watching your booth earlier," whispered Susan, a nurse who worked with Raj at the local hospital. He didn't look too happy about how popular you are. Raj shrugged. I'm just doing my job, helping people. Well, not everyone appreciates that, apparently, Susan replied, nodding discreetly toward Wilson, who was indeed observing their booth with a frown. The afternoon's main event was approaching, a community recognition ceremony where local heroes would be honored for their contributions to Riverdale. Chief Roberts had organized this as part of his initiative to bring the town together and highlight positive role models from all backgrounds. The seats in front of the stage filled quickly as the time for the ceremony approached. Officer Wilson was assigned to stand near the stage, maintaining security during the presentations. He watched impassively as community members filed in, taking mental notes of who sat where. Little did he know that this ceremony would change everything, not just for him, but for the entire town of Riverdale. The events about to unfold would force him to confront his deep-seated prejudices in the most public and unexpected way possible, leading to the ultimate humiliation that would shake him to his core. As Chief Roberts approached the microphone, the crowd hushed in anticipation. Wilson stood at attention, unaware that his world was about to turn upside down in front of everyone he knew. Chief Roberts tapped the microphone twice, the sound echoing through the community center. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to our annual Community Unity Fair. His voice was warm and genuine as he looked out at the diverse faces in the audience. Today is about celebrating what makes Riverdale special, our people. People from all walks of life who come together to make this town better every day. Officer Wilson shifted his weight from one foot to another, scanning the crowd with practiced indifference. These community events were necessary evils in his mind, photo opportunities that did little to address real issues of law and order as he saw them. Our first recognition today, continued Chief Roberts, is for someone who has shown extraordinary dedication to the health and well-being of our community. Wilson's gaze drifted to the exit doors, mentally calculating how soon he could leave after the ceremony ended. This individual moved to our town just 5 years ago but has already made an incredible impact. They've organized free health clinics, visited our schools to talk about health education, and even established an emergency fund for families who can't afford medical care. A murmur of appreciation ran through the crowd. Several people turned to look at Dr. Patel, who sat modestly in the third row. I'm proud to present this year's Community Service Award to Dr. Raj Patel, announced Chief Roberts, beaming as he held up a handsome plaque. Applause erupted as Raj stood, looking genuinely surprised. He made his way to the stage, shaking hands with people who reached out to congratulate him as he passed. Wilson's body tensed. He watched Raj climb the steps to the stage with a tight-lipped expression. Just 3 weeks ago, he had pulled the doctor over for what Wilson had claimed was a broken taillight, though the light had been functioning perfectly. Raj took the plaque from Chief Roberts with a humble nod. Thank you, he said into the microphone. I'm honored, though this recognition isn't necessary. I simply do what any of us would do, try to help where I can. The crowd's applause intensified, and someone in the back whistled appreciatively. But I would like to take this moment, Raj continued once the noise died down, to thank those who have welcomed me to Riverdale and made me feel at home. And to acknowledge that not everyone has had that same welcome. Wilson stiffened, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on his holstered weapon, a nervous habit. I believe that true community safety comes when we all feel protected and valued, Raj said, his eyes briefly meeting Wilson's across the room. When law enforcement and citizens work together with mutual respect. Chief Roberts nodded enthusiastically, completely unaware of the tension building in his officer. Our next recognition, Roberts said, taking back the microphone as Raj returned to his seat, is for heroism in the face of danger. Wilson's shoulders relaxed slightly. This award would likely go to a fellow officer or firefighter, a return to the natural order of things as he saw it. 2 months ago, there was a serious car accident on Highway 16. A vehicle had flipped over and caught fire. Without hesitation, two individuals rushed to help, pulling the driver and passenger to safety just before the car exploded. Wilson nodded to himself. He remembered the incident report. The police had arrived just after the rescue. The courage shown that day saved 2 lives, Roberts continued. I'd like to call to the stage Mr. Lee Wei and his teenage son, Gene Wei. Wilson's head snapped up as a middle-aged Asian man and a teenager stood from their seats near the front. The officer's surprise was evident to anyone looking his way. What the audience didn't know, but Chief Roberts did, was that Officer Wilson had previously stopped Mr. Wei's vehicle multiple times without cause. Wilson had even issued a warning citation for suspicious behavior when Wei was simply waiting outside his own son's school. As the Weiss reached the stage to thunderous applause, Wilson felt the first trickle of sweat running down his back. Chief Roberts handed them each a medal, then gestured for Mr. Wei to speak. We did nothing special, Mr. Wei said softly. Anyone would help their neighbors in danger. His son Gene added, that's what my parents taught me, we're all part of the same community. Wilson shifted uncomfortably under the hot stage lights. The ceremony was far from over, but already a pattern was emerging that would soon make his position unbearably clear to everyone in attendance. The ceremony continued as Chief Roberts called more community members to the stage. Each recipient shared a similar background. They were individuals Wilson had either harassed, ticketed unfairly, or treated with suspicion solely based on their appearance. There was Mrs. Rodriguez, a grandmother who ran the local bakery, recognized for donating bread and pastries to the homeless shelter every week. Wilson had once accused her nephew of loitering when he was simply waiting for a ride outside the library. Next came Sam Washington, a high school basketball coach honored for mentoring at-risk youth. Wilson had pulled him over 3 times in a single month, each time claiming he fit the description of someone reported suspicious in the area. With each new award recipient, Wilson felt more eyes turning toward him. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Even those who had previously given him the benefit of the doubt could no longer ignore the pattern. Officer Garcia, standing at the other end of the stage, caught Wilson's eye and gave him a knowing look. Wilson quickly averted his gaze, pretending to scan the crowd for security threats. Our next recognition, Chief Roberts announced, his voice ringing clearly through the hall, is for extraordinary courage in speaking up against injustice. Wilson's collar suddenly felt too tight. He tugged at it discreetly, trying to maintain his professional composure. Sometimes the bravest thing someone can do is tell the truth, even when that truth is difficult to hear, Roberts continued. This award goes to someone who had the courage to come forward with evidence of systematic discrimination within our community. The room fell silent. Wilson's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to maintain a neutral expression. I'd like to invite Officer Natalie Parker to the stage, Roberts said, turning to look directly at a female officer standing near the back of the room. Wilson's face drained of color. Parker was a rookie who had been riding with him for the past month as part of her field training. She walked confidently to the stage, her back straight and her eyes focused ahead, deliberately avoiding Wilson's stunned gaze. Officer Parker noticed a disturbing pattern during her training period, Roberts explained to the hushed audience. She documented instances where citizens were treated differently based solely on their race or ethnicity. When she brought this evidence to my attention, she knew it might make her unpopular with some colleagues, but she believed in doing what was right. Wilson's hand trembled slightly as the full realization hit him. Parker had been watching him, documenting his actions, reporting back to the chief. All those times he thought he was teaching her real policing, she had been silently gathering evidence against him. I just did my duty, Parker said simply when handed the microphone. I took an oath to protect and serve everyone equally. That's not just a slogan, it's the foundation of justice. The audience erupted in applause. Several people rose to their feet, giving her a standing ovation. Wilson stood frozen, feeling as though the stage lights were exposing him like a specimen under a microscope. Every eye in the room seemed to be shifting between Parker and himself. The connection was unmistakable. And Chief Roberts wasn't finished yet. Chief Roberts cleared his throat as Officer Parker returned to her seat. The audience's applause finally settled, leaving a charged atmosphere in the community center. "Before we continue with our final awards," Roberts said, "I'd like to share something with all of you." He pulled a folder from beneath the podium and opened it slowly. 6 months ago, our department implemented body cameras for all officers. Roberts paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "This was part of our transparency initiative, which I believe is essential for community trust." Wilson felt his stomach drop. The body cameras had been a point of contention among some officers, including himself. He had complained loudly about privacy concerns and unnecessary oversight. "These cameras have provided valuable insight into our daily operations," Roberts continued. "They've helped us identify areas where we excel and areas where we need improvement." Wilson's eyes darted toward the exit doors. They suddenly seemed very far away. "As your police chief, it's my responsibility to ensure that every citizen is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background." Roberts looked directly at Wilson now. "Unfortunately, I've discovered that's not always been the case." A murmur spread through the audience. Several people turned to look at Wilson, whose face had flushed a deep red. "Officer Wilson," Roberts said clearly, "would you please join me on stage?" The room fell completely silent. Wilson stood frozen for several seconds, unable to process what was happening. This was not part of the program he'd been briefed on. "Officer Wilson," Roberts repeated, his voice firmer. With wooden legs, Wilson climbed the steps to the stage. Each footfall echoed in the silent room. He took his place beside the chief, staring straight ahead, avoiding the hundreds of eyes fixed on him. "James," Roberts said, his voice lower but still audible through the microphone, "I've reviewed over 40 hours of your body camera footage from the past 3 months." Wilson swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "What I saw was deeply troubling." Roberts turned to address the audience again. "I saw a pattern of behavior that contradicts everything our department stands for." Someone in the audience gasped. Most sat in stunned silence. "I believe in second chances," Roberts continued. "I believe people can change when they recognize their mistakes and take responsibility for them." Wilson stared at his shoes, unable to meet the eyes of the community members he'd sworn to protect and serve. "Today, in front of everyone gathered here, I want to give Officer Wilson the opportunity to acknowledge his actions and commit to doing better." Roberts turned to Wilson and handed him the microphone. The weight of it felt enormous in Wilson's trembling hands. The silence stretched painfully as Wilson struggled to find words. Every moment that passed amplified his humiliation. People he had mistreated sat in the audience, watching him squirm under the spotlight of public scrutiny. Wilson began, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I don't know what to say." "The truth would be a good start," called out a voice from the audience. Wilson recognized it as belonging to Mrs. Rodriguez's nephew, whom he'd harassed multiple times. Wilson looked out at the sea of faces, faces of people he had judged based solely on their skin color or ethnic background. People he had never bothered to know as individuals. For the first time, he saw them clearly, and he saw himself through their eyes. The realization was crushing. Wilson's mouth felt dry as cotton as he stood before the crowd, microphone clutched in his sweaty palm. The spotlight seemed to burn through him, exposing every prejudiced thought he'd ever harbored. He started again, his voice barely audible. He cleared his throat. "I've been an officer in this town for 15 years. The statement hung in the air, damning rather than defensive. 15 years of power. 15 years of unchecked bias. The footage doesn't lie," Chief Roberts said quietly beside him. "Neither do the testimonies we've gathered. Wilson felt lightheaded. His carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. He had always justified his actions as good policing or following instincts, but stripped of those excuses, the truth was painfully clear. We have documented evidence of at least 27 incidents in the past 3 months alone, Roberts continued, addressing the audience. Traffic stops without cause. Excessive questioning. Selective enforcement of minor violations. Each word was another nail in the coffin of Wilson's career and reputation. He could feel the weight of every stare, every whispered comment. From the third row, Dr. Patel spoke up. "May I say something, Chief?" Roberts nodded, and Raj stood. The doctor's expression wasn't vengeful or angry. If anything, it held a hint of compassion that made Wilson feel even worse. "Officer Wilson, I don't believe you're an evil person," Raj said calmly. "But your actions have caused real harm. 3 months ago, my son was driving home from college to surprise me for my birthday. You pulled him over twice in one day. He was so shaken by the experience that he almost turned around and went back to school." Wilson remembered the stops. He'd claimed the young man was driving erratically, though he hadn't been. "What hurts most," Raj continued, "isn't being treated differently. It's knowing that no matter how much we contribute, how much we belong, some people will never see past our skin color." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Several people nodded. "I don't want your badge, Officer Wilson," Raj said. "I want your understanding. I want you to see us, really see us, as your neighbors, not as threats." Wilson's eyes burned with unexpected tears. He blinked rapidly, trying to maintain what little dignity he had left. From another part of the room, Coach Washington stood up. "My players look up to the police. They want to trust you. But how can I tell them to respect authority when that authority doesn't respect them?" The truth of these words hit Wilson like a physical blow. Mrs. Rodriguez rose next. "My grandson wants to be a police officer someday. What would you tell him about fair treatment if he were standing here now?" One by one, people stood and shared their experiences, not with rage or hatred, but with honest pain and genuine questions that demanded answers. Wilson had nowhere to hide. No radio to call for backup. No patrol car to retreat to. Just the harsh light of truth and hundreds of witnesses to his humiliation. Chief Roberts turned to him. "This is your moment, James. Not to defend yourself, but to listen. To learn. And perhaps, to change." Wilson looked out at the faces before him, faces he had categorized and dismissed based on prejudices he'd never questioned. For the first time, he saw them as individuals with stories, with families, with lives as valuable as his own. And in that moment, the true depth of his shame became unbearable. Wilson's legs nearly gave out beneath him as the weight of his actions pressed down on his shoulders. The microphone felt like an anchor in his hand, dragging him further into the depths of his shame. He tried again, his voice cracking. The words wouldn't come. Chief Roberts placed a steady hand on his shoulder. Not for support, but as a reminder of responsibility. "The body camera footage will be reviewed by an independent civilian oversight committee," Roberts announced to the crowd. "Officer Wilson has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation." A hushed murmur spread through the audience. This was more than just public humiliation, this was real accountability. From the back of the room, an elderly woman stood up slowly. The crowd parted respectfully as Mrs. Johnson, a beloved retired schoolteacher who had taught in Riverdale for over 40 years, made her way forward. Wilson recognized her immediately. Just last month, he had stopped her grandson for allegedly jaywalking, making the young man late for a job interview. Wilson hadn't issued a ticket, he rarely did in these stops, but the message had been clear: "You don't belong here." Mrs. Johnson approached the stage with deliberate steps, her eyes fixed on Wilson. The room fell silent again. "Officer Wilson," she said, her voice clear despite her age. "I taught in this town when schools were first integrated. I've seen hatred up close. I've seen fear disguised as authority." Wilson couldn't meet her gaze. "But I've also seen people change," she continued, surprising him. "I've seen hearts soften and minds open. The question is, are you willing to do that hard work?" The directness of her question left him nowhere to hide. For the first time since being called to the stage, Wilson found his voice. "I never thought of myself as..." He began, then stopped. The word racist hung unspoken in the air. "None of us do," Mrs. Johnson said gently. "That's the problem." Something broke inside Wilson, a wall he had built years ago, brick by brick, to protect himself from examining his own beliefs. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words barely audible at first. Then louder, "I'm sorry." It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was a start. "Sorry needs to be the beginning, not the end," said Coach Washington from his seat. "What happens tomorrow, and the day after that?" Wilson nodded, understanding washing over him like a cold shower. "You're right. I need to do better." Officer Parker, who had exposed his behavior, stood up. "The department is implementing mandatory bias training for all officers. Will you commit to that, not just going through the motions, but really participating?" Wilson looked at her, this rookie who had shown more courage and integrity in her few months on the force than he had in 15 years. "Yes," he said firmly, finding a shred of resolve amid his humiliation. "Yes, I will." Chief Roberts took back the microphone. "This isn't about punishing one officer. This is about healing a community. It's about acknowledging harm and working to repair it." He turned to Wilson. "Are you willing to meet regularly with community members, to listen to their experiences, to learn from them?" Wilson glanced around the room. Faces that had been blurs to him before now came into sharp focus, individuals with lives and stories he had never bothered to understand. "I am," he said, and meant it. The humiliation was complete, but somehow, in that moment of utter exposure, a door had opened, not to redemption, not yet, but to the possibility of change. The following weeks were the hardest of Wilson's life. News of the community center confrontation spread throughout Riverdale like wildfire. Local social media pages buzzed with clips from the body camera footage that Chief Roberts had released as part of the department's new transparency initiative. Wilson couldn't go anywhere without feeling eyes on him. The grocery store, the gas station, his own neighborhood, everywhere, people recognized him as that cop. Some openly glared. Others whispered behind their hands. A few simply turned their backs when he approached. The administrative leave gave him too much time to think. Sitting alone in his living room, Wilson replayed countless interactions from his career, seeing them through new eyes. Traffic stops where he'd been unnecessarily aggressive. Times he'd followed people through stores for no real reason. The different tones he used when addressing different citizens. The evidence was overwhelming, and he had nowhere to hide from it, especially from himself. On the third day of his leave, Wilson's doorbell rang. He opened it to find Dr. Patel standing on his porch. "May I come in?" the doctor asked politely. Wilson stepped aside, stunned by the unexpected visit. "I'm not here to judge you further," Raj said as he took a seat in Wilson's living room. "You've faced enough of that." "I deserved it," Wilson replied quietly. Raj nodded. "Perhaps. But humiliation without growth serves no one." He placed a book on the coffee table between them. "This helped me understand some of my own biases when I first came to America. We all have them, Officer Wilson. The difference is whether we examine them or let them rule us." After Raj left, Wilson picked up the book. It was the first of many he would read in the coming months, books about implicit bias, systemic racism, and the history of policing in America. Books that challenged everything he thought he knew. The mandatory bias training began 2 weeks later. Wilson arrived early, sitting in the front row rather than hiding in the back as he might have done before. Officer Parker noticed this and gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. The training was uncomfortable. Role-playing scenarios forced Wilson to confront his automatic assumptions. Discussions revealed biases he hadn't known he carried. Each session left him mentally exhausted but somehow lighter, as if he was shedding a heavy armor he'd worn for years without realizing its weight. The community meetings were even harder. Twice a month, Wilson sat in a circle with residents from all parts of Riverdale, many of whom had stories about negative encounters with him. He forced himself to listen without becoming defensive, to hear their pain without minimizing it. During one particularly difficult session, a young man described being stopped and questioned by Wilson while walking home from his late-night job. "I was afraid," the young man admitted. "Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I didn't know if I'd make it home that night." The words hit Wilson like a physical blow. He had never considered himself dangerous, just cautious, just doing his job. But in that moment, he understood the fear his uniform and his bias had created. "I'm sorry," Wilson said, the words coming easier now with practice. "That should never have happened." The room fell silent, the simple acknowledgement more powerful than any elaborate apology. Outside the community center after the meeting, Coach Washington approached Wilson in the parking lot. "You showed up," he said simply. "That's something." It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. But it was recognition of effort, and for now, that was enough. 3 months after the community center incident, Wilson received a call from Chief Roberts. "The review board has completed their investigation," Roberts said, his tone neutral. "They've recommended you be allowed to return to duty, with conditions." Wilson gripped the phone tighter. "What conditions?" 6 more months of probation. Continued bias training. Regular check-ins with the Community Oversight Committee. Roberts paused. "And you'll be partnered with Officer Parker." Wilson almost laughed at the irony. The rookie who had exposed him would now be watching his every move. "Is that acceptable to you?" Roberts asked. "Yes," Wilson replied without hesitation. "I want to come back. I want to do better." His first day back was as uncomfortable as he'd expected. Some officers avoided eye contact. Others were overly formal, as if speaking to a stranger rather than a 15-year veteran. The cold shoulder treatment hurt, but Wilson understood it. Trust, once broken, wasn't easily repaired. Parker was waiting by the patrol car, keys in hand. "I'm driving," she said simply. As they pulled out of the station parking lot, Wilson braced himself for a lecture or, worse, silent judgment. Instead, Parker surprised him. "I didn't report you because I hated you," she said, eyes on the road. "I did it because I believed the department could be better. That you could be better." Wilson looked at her, really looked at her for perhaps the first time. Not as a rookie to be molded or a threat to be managed, but as a colleague with her own strong moral compass. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For holding me accountable." Their first call came in minutes later, a suspected shoplifting at a convenience store near the edge of town. As they arrived, Wilson noticed the store owner, Mr. Patel, no relation to the doctor, pointing angrily at a teenage boy who stood with his hands in his pockets, looking scared. 6 months ago, Wilson would have immediately approached the situation with assumptions already formed. Today, he took a deep breath and reminded himself to observe first, judge later. "What's going on here?" he asked, making eye contact with both the store owner and the teen. "He stole candy," Mr. Patel said, gesturing toward the boy. "I saw him put it in his pocket." The boy shook his head frantically. "I didn't. I was just holding it while I got money out." Wilson turned to Parker, who gave him a small nod. This was his call to make. "Let's all take a step back," Wilson said calmly. "Sir, do you have security cameras?" They reviewed the footage together. Sure enough, the boy had indeed put a candy bar in his pocket, but the video continued to show him pulling out his wallet and approaching the counter before Mr. Patel confronted him. "Looks like a misunderstanding," Wilson said, turning to the store owner. He was about to pay. Mr. Patel looked surprised, then slightly embarrassed. I see. I'm sorry for the confusion." The boy's relief was palpable. As they left the store, he gave Wilson a tentative smile. "Thanks, officer." It was a small interaction, barely worth noting in an official report. But for Wilson, it represented something significant, a moment where he had approached a situation without letting bias dictate his response. In the patrol car, Parker glanced at him. "Good call back there." Wilson nodded, feeling a small but genuine sense of accomplishment. The road ahead would be long and difficult, rebuilding trust always was. But for the first time since his public humiliation, he felt something like hope. 1 year to the day after the community center incident, Riverdale held another community unity fair. Wilson stood at the entrance, not as security this time, but as an attendee. He had debated whether to come at all, knowing his presence might make some uncomfortable. In the end, Chief Roberts had convinced him. "Healing doesn't happen in hiding," the chief had said. The fair was in full swing, with familiar booths and activities spread throughout the community center. Wilson recognized many faces, some that now nodded in cautious acknowledgement, others that still turned away when they saw him. Dr. Patel's health awareness booth was busy as usual. When the doctor spotted Wilson, he waved him over. "Officer Wilson, perfect timing. We need volunteers for the blood pressure demonstration." It was a small gesture, but a meaningful one, an invitation to participate rather than just observe. As the afternoon progressed, Wilson found himself in conversations he would have avoided a year ago. He listened more than he spoke, learning about community concerns and perspectives he had previously dismissed. When the time came for the recognition ceremony, Wilson took a seat near the back, not wanting to draw attention. Chief Roberts took the stage, looking out over the gathered community. "A year ago, we stood in this room and faced some uncomfortable truths," Roberts began. "We acknowledged that our department had failed some of you. That individuals within our ranks had allowed bias to influence their actions." Wilson kept his eyes on the floor, feeling the weight of those words. "Today, I want to share what we've done since then," Roberts continued. "Our officers have completed over 2,000 hours of bias and cultural sensitivity training. We've established a civilian oversight committee that reviews all complaints and body camera footage. And our community dialogue sessions have created connections that never existed before." Mrs. Johnson, the retired teacher, stood up from her seat. "And has it made a difference, Chief? In real terms?" Roberts nodded. "Our data shows traffic stops are down 30%, while serious crime arrests are up. More importantly, community satisfaction with police interactions has improved significantly." From the middle of the audience, Coach Washington spoke up. "I've noticed a difference in how my players talk about the police. There's less fear, more respect. That matters." Wilson felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Officer Parker beside him. "The chief wants you up there," she said quietly. Wilson shook his head. "I shouldn't." "This isn't about you," Parker interrupted. "It's about showing people that change is possible." Reluctantly, Wilson made his way to the stage. The room didn't fall silent this time, the murmurs continued, but without the hostility of a year ago. "Officer Wilson has been part of our department's transformation," Roberts said. "He's faced his biases, done the work, and become a model for what accountability looks like in practice." Wilson stepped up to the microphone, humbled by words he didn't feel he deserved. "A year ago, I stood here in the worst moment of my career, and my life," he began. I faced a truth about myself that I had ignored for too long. He looked out at the faces watching him, Dr. Patel, Mrs. Rodriguez, Coach Washington, Mrs. Johnson, and dozens of others. I won't ask for forgiveness, Wilson continued. But I want you to know that I'm grateful for the second chance, and grateful to this community for holding me accountable. He stepped back, not wanting to take up more space or time than necessary. As he returned to his seat, a young boy, Mrs. Rodriguez's grandson, approached him. My grandma says you're trying to be a better person, the boy said simply. Wilson nodded. I am trying. The boy considered this for a moment. That's good. Everyone should try to be better. Out of the mouths of children, Wilson thought. The humiliation he had faced a year ago had been necessary, painful but necessary. The journey since then had been harder than anything he'd ever done, forcing him to confront deeply rooted beliefs and behaviors. He wasn't fixed, he knew better than to think that. This would be lifelong work. But as he looked around the community center, at the diverse faces of the town he had sworn to protect and serve, he felt something he hadn't expected to feel again: belonging. Not the false belonging that comes from power or authority, but the real belonging that comes from humility, accountability, and the ongoing commitment to do better, one day, one interaction, one person at a time.